Cool. So next up, we have a talk from the fine folks at Twitter, who are one of our delightful sponsors and doing some really interesting stuff with documentation, and pretty much everyone here is just using it during the conference with the hashtags, so I don't really think I need to say much more about Twitter. So yeah, without further ado, I'll let them talk about what they're doing with docs.
Thanks. Thank you. So my name is Marko Gargenta. My background is a software entrepreneur, but I also published a couple of books on technical software stuff, one with Pearson and two with O'Reilly. So I have a little bit of experience with technical writing, but I don't consider myself a writer day to day.
And hey, I'm Simeon Franklin. I am a longtime software developer, a Pythonista. I've worked with Marko for the last couple of years and done some writing, courseware, labs, exercises, but I am also not a technical writer. So
this is a story that started about 9 months ago with Twitter acquiring a company that Simeon and I used to work at called Maracana. It was a software training company. And they acquired us with a mission of creating Twitter University and helping Twitter become a learning organization. And that's something we felt quite comfortable with. We knew a lot about software training. But then somebody said, you guys should also run the technical documentation department. And we didn't quite know what that meant at the time. So what we basically took on is figuring out what does it mean to do technical documentation at Twitter. Just one thing that I want to kind of make clear is that what we're talking about is the documentation for the engineers to engineers. So we're not so much talking about the API public-facing user/developer documentation. That was a subject of the previous, somebody mentioned the previous API talk, but it's more for the engineers talking to engineers. So Twitter is very much a data-driven organization. So first thing that we wanted to do is find out how bad it is. And we ran a survey. Everyone can run a survey at Twitter. So we surveyed about 1,000, 1,200 engineers or so at the time, and we basically asked, how do you feel about the documentation? How likely are you to recommend the documentation to other fellow engineers? We use the NPS metrics. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Net Promoter Score? Some of you. So it's basically, there's a study that basically says the only question you need to ask is how likely somebody is to recommend something, and that basically tells you everything. So you can kind of tell how people felt about the documentation internally. So most of them did not like it. If our department was an independent company, we would be out of business really quickly. There's a second question that is also part of the NPS, which is, why do you feel that way? And we got a lot of answers. We got a couple of hundred answers in the why section, and it's a free-form English. So we started sort of bucketing these answers into specific categories, and then figuring out what is the common theme. And as you can tell, one theme that kind of emerged is that the documentation either doesn't exist, or it's stale, out of date, or it's impossible to find.
And we kind of have a problem of resources. So we looked at solving the problem, and you kind of have an idea of the scale of the problem. We're a small division. We've got 3 tech writers, but they're full-time employed. They're embedded with teams. They're writing all the documentation they can write as fast as they can. There we go. One of them is cueing me right down there. Thanks, Troy. And we have thousands of engineers at Twitter writing software. We have hundreds of projects. The rate of new software is growing at tremendous speed. The rate of new documentation, well, not so much. So how are we going to solve the problem that we face? That's basically what this talk is about. We are on a journey at the moment. We have a plan. We're executing on our plan. We've had some early successes. We've had a few roadblocks. And some of the things we've tried, it's just honestly too soon to tell. But we'd like to share with you our story. And we're here to participate in the community, hear your story. So we're looking forward to you coming and telling us if you're on the same sort of path or you've been there before. Technical documentation at Twitter, internal docs, engineers to engineers, should be the technical grease, right? It makes all those edges better places. When Team A talks to Team B, if the product is well documented, that's an easy thing. If you want to use an internal API or service, the documentation should make that task a joy, not a subject of friction. And honestly, we don't really have much of a choice about how we're going to fix the problem. Given our resource constraints, if the documentation, internal documentation at Twitter is going to get better, it's going to get better because we're going to have developers write documentation. How are we going to make that happen? It's going to require a change in culture, a change in the way we do software development at Twitter, a change in the way we do documentation at Twitter. So one of the things that we decided early on is, we've already seen one of these sea changes of cultural evolution. Developers are already used to the idea that, hey, they write code for a new feature, and then to get permission to ship that new feature, they also have to have tests, right? They go through a review process, and if you don't have tests that test your code, well, you're not done with the job yet. So we'd like, in an ideal world, to have lots of reviewers saying, hey, that's great, you have code, you have tests, where's the docs? Developers should write the docs as well, and you're not done. Your job isn't done as a developer until there's docs that go along with it.
So basically, to change a culture, somebody once said you need a framework. And so we basically came up with this three-pronged approach how we're going to change the culture, the three of us at Twitter. And it starts by creating something that looks like a stack, because that's what engineers can refer to easily, right? But basically, at the bottom of the stack, we have a platform which we call DocBird, which is our publishing platform, and Simeon is going to talk about that shortly. Just above that, we have a set of templates. This is a set of self-service tools, and basically an attempt to normalize the documentation. And then finally, we have something we call DocDay, which some previous speakers referred to as a doc sprint, which is basically our attempt to socialize or promote documentation and have it be adopted within the organization. So when we kind of tackled on this problem, first thing that we wanted to kind of understand is, where are the docs? This is a pretty big, sizable organization, and it's also growing very rapidly. So we wanted to kind of get an inventory of what does the documentation at Twitter even look like. And we started talking to teams, and there are hundreds of teams at Twitter, right? Thousands of engineers. And what we found out is that the docs are all over the place. There was basically no rules, no normalization, nothing about where the documentation should live or what it should look like. We found that most of the documents lived in a wiki. We use Confluence. And we found out that some teams, especially the open source teams, used Markdown or similar, and basically kept the documentation alongside the code. And there were some teams that were didn't really care about their customers too much. They even kept their documentation in Google Docs. So it was great for them to share the documents internally, and the fact that nobody can find it was okay.
So we're kind of new to the TechDocs world, and I'm absorbing knowledge as quickly as I can, but I can't resist the opportunity to do a little market research. So I think maybe this is a topic of disagreement. Wikis are a good medium for managing technical documentation. Fair statement? Could I see a hand? Ooh, less disagreement than I thought. Okay. So at Twitter, we use the wiki for all the things, right? Everything is in the wiki. We've got 60,000 pages, 150 spaces. Every team has got its own space. If you go to search for a particular internal product, you'll find it. You'll find the documentation in the wiki very likely, but you'll also find every note that every other developer ever wrote about that thing. The search is noisy. Wikis, by their very nature, they're kind of unstructured, right? It's great. You can edit a page, you can make a new page. It takes discipline to impose kind of structure, consistent user experience on a wiki. And I could talk about the reasons why we decided a wiki is not the best solution for our technical documentation. But the one that was kind of the clincher for us, I guess, is if we're going to get developers to write documentation at Twitter, we're going to recognize that developers they already have a workflow. They already have tools, they already have processes that they're really committed to. And we're going to have to make the documentation production process as much like the code production process as possible. So in particular, developers are used to checking the code into, Git, and they're happy to version things and fork and branch and merge. They've got lots of tools for messing with plain text, you'd be shocked at how religious developers can get about values for $editor. They've got processes for publishing their stuff. When they're done, they know how to get reviews, they know how to push it back to master, and all those things need to be true of documentation as well. So we're going to have to live with documentation that is plain text, that lives with the source code, that can be managed by Git, that can be edited with $editor, that can be reviewed and can be published by just pushing to master. And I might say, maybe it makes you sad, but that's easy for the developer, that's hard for the tech writer. We're making the tech writers adopt developer workflows, and that's really unfair. But there's a lot of them and not as many of us, I guess I get to say. So technology to the rescue. More market research. Do people know what Sphinx is here? Is that kind of just common knowledge? Lots of good head nods. Cool, awesome, some hands. So Sphinx, if you don't know, is a documentation publishing platform. You write plain text. It's a markup language, kind of think like Markdown. And out of it you get structured output, maybe a website that has a search and a table of contents. And Sphinx in particular is a plain text markup language that has lots of concepts for documenting code. It's kind of a tool for particularly that job. And this is probably a really dumb question at a conference called Write the Docs, but everybody knows what Read the Docs is, right? Yeah. So I would argue that any engineering organization of sufficient size, Read the Docs is a really good idea. Eric's project, just you tell it about your repo, it pulls your code, it builds your docs, it hosts your docs for you as well. Any engineering organization of sufficient size is going to have to implement an internal Read the Docs. So we've got lots of code we can't share with the outside world, but we need exactly the same sort of infrastructure, and that's essentially what DocBird is. DocBird is our own reimplementation of Read the Docs. It looks at all the internal repos, it finds stuff that looks like Sphinx documentation, it builds it, it provides a search engine server-side across all the documentation, and then we also did a little bit of client wrapping. We distribute a binary with the way developers at Twitter expect to get utilities that makes a lot of assumptions about themes and extensions and basically how Sphinx will work so that they don't have to worry about that. So DocBird is kind of our first stab at improving the documentation from a technological perspective. And we already bumped into, sorry, one slide ahead. What DocBird gets us then is, a website. The developer doesn't have to worry about what it looks like, doesn't have to worry about imposing structure. That's kind of all done already. We bumped into a few technical hitches, or maybe they're social and cultural hitches as well. Asking people to move from, say, editing a wiki or storing Markdown with their code to using Sphinx. The first thing that people had to do was, Sphinx wants you to write restructured text, RST. And a lot of people had what I consider to be like a normal response to that, like another markup language is their docs, cool, I'll learn it, no big deal. A few people said, no, I won't do it, I know Markdown already. It's like a deal breaker. So we're kind of handling that with DocBird. We'll automatically use pandoc to translate your Markdown to RST for you. That more or less works. Another technical roadblock that we ran into, a desire for people that was a showstopper, is lots of developers want API docs. So documentation that's generated automatically from the source code, right? More or less a telephone book for your source code, maybe some comments in it. And I'm guessing from the tech writer's perspective that this kind of documentation is not that useful. A few yeses and nos. So the output of tools like JavaDoc, and my first initial response to this request was, sure, absolutely, I'll be happy to build your API documentation for you. That turns out not to be as much fun. Some projects make you, build the project to generate the code to be documented, and I'm looking at mobile development. That's not always easy in a Linux environment. We've got an SDK that's supposed to be installed by, GUIs. So that's a bit of a roadblock, and for the moment, we're letting developers generate API docs themselves and upload them. Other technical kind of roadblocks we bumped into. Twitter is a poly-language organization, right? We have a lot of code that's written in Python, and Sphinx is a Python project, and it's great for documenting Python code. We have a lot of code that's written in Java, and Sphinx actually has a pretty good Java domain. You can document Java code with Sphinx. We have a lot of code written in Scala. Sphinx support for that, not so much. There's like an alpha domain that doesn't do much at the moment. And I've got other language targets that Sphinx hasn't thought about yet. So our tool's there. It's it's satisfying some of our use cases, but we've bumped into a few use cases we didn't contemplate when we started. One that kind of amuses me is we're going to some effort to change the way we do documentation, to work the way developers want to work. Plain text, stored with the source code, organized like the source code, use your tools, use Git, all that good stuff. And then when we've changed everything to suit the developers come back and say, hey, it would be cool if you could just hit edit in a browser and then hit save, because that was nice. So, I guess there is a point in favor of wikis, and for me that means I have to script a branch and a merge and a review request, and it's non-trivial, but we've got a bunch of feature requests actually, and that's been, aside from terrifying, that's been really exciting. People see documentation as a platform, and they start to think about lots of cool things you can do with a platform for documentation that we control. People want to do things like have medium-style comments in their docs, or be able to +1 or like a doc. I guess the term of art in our circles would be favorite. People want to be able to search and know about like project metadata. Show me results in just Java projects, for instance. So people are excited when we show them a platform. They're excited about some of the ways that could make their life easier as consumers of documentation. And Marko mentioned earlier, we try to be a data-driven organization. So whenever we undertake an initiative, we say, hey, what should we be measuring? How can we know we're going in the right direction? We're moving the needle in a positive direction. And there's a lot of these feature requests that would generate things we could measure. People saying, this piece of documentation helped me out, that's a valuable piece of data, actually. But the thing that we chose to attempt to measure is something that showed up rather prominently in the survey. Aside from docs that weren't there, a big complaint was docs that are there but they're lying, right? They documented the product as it existed like a year ago, and now they're less than useful. So keeping track of documentation being in sync with code, well, if our documentation is plain text that lives in the same repo, tracking stuff like drift isn't that hard, right? If there's 1,000 commits to the code and none of those commits touch the docs folder, probably your documentation has some lies at this point. And maybe we could even get more sophisticated than that. Maybe we could compare size. If you have 1,000 source code files and one documentation source code file, maybe you don't have enough docs. There might be some more things that we could measure along those lines.
So that's the platform, sort of the technical side of things. From the management side of things, the problem was that when we inherited this team of 3 people, these 3 people were actually spoken for. So what I mean by that is they were committed to specific projects working on specific documentation. So there are basically 0 individuals working on moving the documentation company-wide. And remember, we have over 1,000 engineers. So it's a pretty big scale and nobody working on that. So what we did is first we took about 20% of other clients' time off of the books. We basically said, like, look, let's just kind of take about a day, a week away and start thinking about how we can move the needle for the entire company. And basically it's the old consulting versus contracting approach. So we had an organization of contractors that were basically a body shop placed in other clients' working with other clients' backlog, and what we're working towards is switching it into an organization that's more like an agency, where basically we come up with the best practices, we come up with our own how-tos, our own services that we provide, our own ways to measure it, etc. And basically, most of all, own our own backlog, so get to prioritize the projects. So as part of that, we started working toward a set of templates. This is our attempt to create self-service tools. One of the goals that we're trying to solve with the templates is the problem of there are no docs, right? They're simply projects that did not have documentation at all. So what we wanted to do is enable developers to really quickly bootstrap their project to a minimum viable documentation. So templates allow them to do exactly that. The other problem that we're trying to solve is make our engineering organization very efficient, which means basically an engineer should really quickly be able to figure out what your product, like your service or your library does, and be able to use it. But that's not going to work if the documentation is not somewhat normalized. So for example, we should use a similar language, right? So call the user guide, have a tutorial, get started section, things like that. So basically as we created the templates, we try to standardize or normalize the documentation across the entire org. This is sort of what a set of templates look like. So we created again, we did it in DocBird, so it's plain text, and basically created a simple README file, created default sections, created a little about us, and this solves the problem that somebody earlier was talking about, the blank page, right? So we don't want anybody to start with a blank page. We're going to populate the questions that they should answer and basically be able to bootstrap the docs. And like I said, it's at the end of the day just plain text in Markdown format. So if you have a new project, you can just fork our Git repo and off you go and you have your docs. One thing that we are trying to do with this approach of having everyone on the same platform and having everyone have at least the minimum viable documentation is essentially gamify the documentation. So we want to point out or publicly shame teams that don't have at least that minimum set of docs.
And we're sorry, we didn't get the memo. We totally would have had SLAs on this slide if we knew.
So like everything else, we love to measure things so that we know that we are successful. And when it comes to normalization, essentially what we wanted to do is we wanted to figure out how consistent are our documents, how consistent is that user experience. If I'm just on some random team and I want to use another team's library or service or a tool, how easy is it for somebody to figure that out? So one of the things that we care about is the coverage. Our goal is to basically have 100% of all our projects, known projects, covered with the same set of docs. One of the ways we're going to get to that is that we're essentially not going to just say, hey, shut down your Confluence docs and move it over to DocBird, but instead we're going to bootstrap all the code projects in the repositories that we have with simple README templates that are essentially going to be pointers to all known documents. So basically each team is going to be just responsible for having at least a README file pointing to all the docs that they know exist, either on GitHub or Confluence or Google Doc or wherever.
Okay, so we're tackling the problem of platform with technology a bit. We're trying to leverage our tech writers. With the templates, the tech writers can write the docs for hundreds of projects, simultaneously without extra effort. The last initiative that we're undertaking is to try and change the culture by building a community. Right? People need to be seen doing this, and taking this approach to documentation needs to be seen as the new normal. It's just what you do at Twitter. So DocDay is basically just a one-day hack day. We started out jotting down some notes. We know from education, and particularly education at places like Twitter, developers they're smart, curious people. Half the battle is just getting them to show up. If you can get them to commit to sit in a room with you for a day, some stuff will get done. So we sketched out all day long, we will provide you with a little bit of training. We'll provide you with content experts. We'll provide you with editors who will help you. But you're going to work on your documentation project. And of course, we made it a class because that's kind of what we do. That's where we're most comfortable. But the point of DocDay is just the recognition that, hey, there could be great tools. There can be useful templates. But it's all about culture. Like, it's all about community. It's all about getting people to actually do these things and internalize the reasons for doing them. Somebody spoke earlier about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. That's been one of the most heartening things on this project is we're kind of still in stealth mode. We'll talk a little bit more about how things are going, but we haven't done any sort of managerial mandate or organization-wide announcement. But I get about a person a week coming to me saying, like, I'm really excited about DocBird, and how do I write new docs, and how do I get them on your platform? We're hoping to amplify that effect rather significantly. We spoke to a group of senior engineers at Twitter who are morally in charge, perhaps, and they've agreed to voluncourse a bunch of key projects to come attend DocDay, build some docs, and socialize our platform for us.
So again, the problem that we're trying to solve is shift the responsibility for writing the documentation from the tech writers, because there aren't many of us, to the actual engineers. And we're basically taking a sort of like a two-step approach to that. On one hand, we're telling the engineers that lack of documentation should be considered technical debt. Just like lack of unit testing is considered technical debt. You should not be able to ship your code. Your peers should not allow you to ship your code if you don't have the docs, period, done. On the other side, we're also telling the engineers sort of like from a positive reinforcement, we're saying, hey, if you want other teams to adopt your service or your library and you want them to use it, you need to package it. We learned that from the open source, right? Like projects that don't have docs simply don't get used as much, right? So we're basically educating them that this is sort of like their sales/marketing tool to have other teams adopt their stuff, and it's sort of like keeps them in business essentially. So how do we measure that we're successful in having the end users adopt this, and how do we know that the community is actually working? So again, we kind of thought about this for a while, and we kind of came back to the Net Promoter Score. So that's essentially our metric. Partially because it's relatively straightforward to do, partially because we have historic data, so we can actually point back to 2 quarters or 3 quarters back and say, hey, look, we've actually been moving the needle organization-wide, so this is working. So our goal is not that high for now. It's just to have at least a positive Net Promoter Score, because as you remember, we started with a very bad situation in terms of the documentation.
So kind of where we are with the 3 initiatives that we've launched. So our platform is up and running. Like I said, we're kind of in stealth mode at the moment. We've had no organizational-wide announcement. We haven't had any managers ordering people to use the platform. We have about a dozen projects using DocBird right now, and we're acquiring, again, without outreach, kind of a customer a week. We're hoping that our community initiative, DocBird and DocDay, and getting that to be a reoccurring pattern. People committing to spend at least just 1 full day on your team's documentation on a bi-monthly basis or a quarterly basis will triple the people who are using our platform at the moment. And we're beginning to promote the use of templates. The most scary thing in the world for people starting with new documentation is that white screen, that blank screen, the what do I do? So we're hoping to quickly drive up the low-hanging fruit, the missing documentation. And so far we've taken purely a carrot-based approach, and this is not, again, this is not extrinsic motivation. We're not offering people money or really fine booze if you use our product. We're saying, like, let us help you succeed. Let us help your software be more useful to your fellow developers. Let us help you keep people from bugging you as much because they can't figure out how to do the thing that they need to do. So it's been totally a carrot-based approach. We have talked with management and senior engineers at Twitter and gotten approval in theory for our general approach and the recognition that, well, any large organization, eventually there are some sticks, will probably mandate the use of our platform for all new projects, and at some point maybe for all projects, period. But it's a work in progress. It's a story that we've started. We have some early returns, but it's a story that's still in progress. We don't know how the story turns out. So I'm here as someone who's not a tech writer, who has not been part of the documentarian community, to share my story with you and hopefully to learn from some of you. I've really been enjoying the conversation. I'm hoping to have some more specifically on-point conversations. If you've been on this kind of story before, shifting an organization's practice, figuring out the best ways to encourage developers to write docs, come find us. We would love to hang out with you downstairs maybe and chat at length.
One thing that we learned from the open source community, from our software development practices, is that we have a lot of smart people at Twitter, but there are a lot more smart people who don't work at Air. So innovation happens elsewhere, right? That's true for the open source software, and it's very much true for the technical documentation as well. So everything that we do, we're trying to do in the open. So from open sourcing the templates and the platform to sharing our experience and things that we kind of learn along the way. So follow us at TechDocs. We're going to be basically sharing our story and the good, bad, and the ugly, and tell you what works and what doesn't. And with that, thank you, and we're open for some questions.
Questions?
I heard that you're hiring. Are you open to remotely located people? Because I have a really good candidate in Salt Lake City.
For technical documentation?
Yeah.
Yes, we are in general.
Okay,
Yes.
I know a guy who's a god. I'll give him the name.
Yeah.
I guess that was a question. So if there's any urban airship people here, I actually used to work there, and we went through a very similar process. So you all should talk.
Okay.
Hi, and thanks for your intriguing talk. I'm trying to understand what problem are you solving by moving to the sort of Git-based framework? That is, the technical challenges of moving off the wiki at a glance seem kind of discommensurate with the amount of benefit that you're getting from essentially providing a new platform. Is the idea that it'll encourage acculturation to provide a workflow that's similar to what developers are already doing? And if so, do you have any indications at this point that that's in fact occurring?
So mostly we have negative indications. The cultural response of developers to the documentation that exists in the wiki is to see it as something separate and distinct from their product. So they make changes to the product, and they may or may not know that there's documentation, and if there is, it's not really their problem. It's somebody else's job. Just moving the home for docs psychologically says to the developer, like, hey, this is your repo, this is your stuff, this is your problem to fix. My own background is from open source, and I'm not coming up with anything new or original, just kind of applying things that I've seen work before, and so some of the successful projects in the open source world that I've seen succeed and flourish because of great documentation have kind of followed this pattern. I've been happy to submit patches like to the Django framework and have people say, that's great, go edit the docs and reflect the change as well.
I had a question. First of all, I love the talk, and I'd love to talk to you guys more. Part of what you've done is give me some ideas for how I can work with the guys I think of as my developers to provide more of the kind of platform you've described, because they would love it. But one of the carrots that I've given them that I didn't hear you talk about so much is I heard a little bit of resistance to the request to publish API docs. What I've done is get my developers to comment their code better. And the better they comment their code, the more work they get from me, because the more information they give me in their comments, the more information I have to work with to do other stuff that supports them. I'm a limited resource too. I work on a lot of other stuff. But I just wondered whether you had thought of that kind of carrot, whether there's been some discussion around the API docs. I realize they're not sufficient for the kind of thing you're trying to do. I'm just curious.
Yeah, and for myself, coming from a developer background, I do see the value in API docs. The socialization of API docs depends on the language to some degree. Some teams don't even know about them. Some teams use them religiously as a reference, and the reluctance to publish them turned out to be technical limitations. If you want to build an Android project, you got to install the right SDK with GUI tools. Lots of difficulty, stuff that's easy to do on the developer's macOS laptop. So I'm currently letting them build their own API docs and upload them. But yeah, telling people you don't even have to learn a new framework, just add better comments the way you're doing it already to your code. So yeah, great suggestion.
All right, one more question.
So I think the Sphinx and restructured text is really great for documenting individual APIs, but how are you handling the information architecture of the whole system? Because you get all these APIs and then they have to integrate together. And one of the things that you guys didn't have any system, it sounds like, but a lot of companies already have a system. And so one of the things that we're running into is the developers want to move to this kind of platform, and writers are a limited resource, but the information architecture is managed through this other system that has a lot of development work in it. And essentially, you kind of throw it all away, and then what you find is you start doing it, you have to rebuild all that stuff. And so I just wondered if you had thought about the information architecture aspects of it.
So with respect to information architecture, so what we're doing right now is we're basically saying, look, there's this concept of a project, right? A project is a unit, and each project should have a documentation for it. And it's going to start with a root document, which is going to be a README, and a README is going to, and then there are going to be some known classes of documents, like a user guide is a known set, getting started is a known set, tutorial is a known set, and we're also normalizing the language for those things. Of course, there are different types of projects, like for example, a service is going to need a runbook, but a library won't. And that's okay, right? So we're sort of, we're introducing a structure, if anything else. And the platform DocBird is actually making that structure then visually consistent, right? Whereas before or currently with the wiki, there isn't really a structure. Like a developer just throws up a page and starts jotting stuff down. And that's great when you don't have anything, when you just kind of want to bootstrap stuff. But at some point, like in our case, we have 60,000 pages. And there is no concept of this page is old or that page is not relevant anymore. So we're hoping that by introducing a structure and ownership right along the side of the code, developers are going to treat the documentation same way they treat code. There isn't usually dead code in your project and so on. So that's kind of how we're hoping to solve the problem of the information architecture.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.